Hello, my name is Kristen Wen. I'm the Director of Grants Administration at the Massachusetts Office for Victim Assistance. During this presentation, I'll walk viewers through MOVA's FY27 Victim and Survivor Services competitive open bid review and evaluation process. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I'll provide a high-level overview of the FY27 funding requests across all of our grant programs that are administered by MOVA. I'll explain how we developed our funding recommendations, including the key phases of the review process for the competitive Victim and Survivor Services opportunity. Finally, I'll walk through the strategy we developed to distribute funding should MOVA receive the trust line state investment. This slide provides an overview of the FY27 funding requests across all of MOVA's grants programs. In total, MOVA received more than $52.7 million in funding requests, which significantly exceeds the resources available for FY27. With approximately $30 million available for grant funding, we are facing a substantial gap between the identified needs and available funding. The majority of requests came through our largest grant program, which is the Victim and Survivor Services, or VSS grant, where we received 110 applications totaling approximately $44.6 million. The Massachusetts Legal Assistance Corporation submitted a continuation request for approximately $2.8 million. Our Safe Plan and Culturally Specific Services programs are also renewal opportunities in FY27, with requests totaling roughly $4 million and $1.4 million, respectively. Overall, these requests underscore both the significant demand for victim services across the Commonwealth and the difficult funding decisions required in a constrained funding environment. While I wanted to highlight the overall funding landscape, the remainder of this presentation will focus on the process and guiding principles MOVA used to develop funding recommendations for the VSS grant opportunity. Next, we will review the VSS review process and recommendation process. The first phase of the application review served as an initial screening to ensure that applicants met all eligibility requirements before advancing to the next stage. Applications were first reviewed for completeness and timeliness, with late or incomplete submissions receiving score reductions in accordance with the instructions in the call for grant applications. MOVA assessed whether applicants met the basic eligibility criteria, including being a public or nonprofit organization operating in Massachusetts and having at least 1 year of experience providing services to victims and survivors of crime. In addition, applicants were required to demonstrate organizational capacity. This included providing information about funding sources beyond the proposed MOVA grant and confirming they maintained a minimum of 3 months of operating cash flow to support the cost reimbursement nature of the grant. Applicants that met these requirements were deemed to be eligible and advanced to the next phase of the review process. Next, I'll walk through the VSS application review process and how MOVA's funding objectives were incorporated into this phase. All applications underwent a comprehensive review process involving 41 peer reviewers and 11 MOVA staff members who reviewed grants as well. To ensure a balanced and consistent evaluation, each application was reviewed by 4 individuals, including both external peer reviewers and internal MOVA staff. Reviewers evaluated 2 elements of each application: the narrative responses and the proposed budget. Both were evaluated for alignment with MOVA's funding objectives. These objectives focused on supporting essential direct services for victims of crime, addressing a broad range of victimization types, and reaching historically and underserved populations and communities. Reviewers considered these priorities when evaluating information about each organization's background, the populations it serves, and the goals and activities proposed through each grant. Budget reviews similarly focused on alignment with these objectives, with particular attention to whether funding requests prioritize the delivery of direct services, such as personnel costs that support the victim services staff. Overall, this process provided a thorough and consistent evaluation of each application while ensuring the funding recommendations were grounded in MOVA's objectives. The final phase of the review process included a comprehensive programmatic and fiscal assessment of all applications. During this phase, members of MOVA's leadership and grants teams reviewed the application scores, written evaluations from peer reviewers and MOVA staff, and overall reviewed and considered funding recommendations. Given the significant gap between funding requests and available resources, this was also the stage where difficult funding decisions were made, including reducing funding requests and removing some applications from consideration. In addition to overall application scores, several factors were received for further consideration. Returning applicants with a history of consistently returning unspent funds received score reductions. This approach helped prioritize limited resources for organizations that have demonstrated strong stewardship of MOVA administered funding. Additional consideration was also given to applicants serving priority geographic areas, including under-resourced regions such as the Cape and Islands and Western Massachusetts. Some score increases were also applied to programs serving victimization types that aligned with federal funding priorities, particularly child abuse and sexual assault. Similarly, applications serving underserved populations received additional consideration with their scores. These populations included survivors of homicide, victims with disabilities, victims who are LGBTQ+, victims who are part of culturally specific communities, victims living in rural or isolated areas, victims involved in the justice system, and older adults. Because of limited funding, applications that did not propose direct service positions were not recommended for funding. Likewise, applications that lacked established infrastructure, such as programs with staffing yet to be determined, were generally not recommended due to concerns about readiness and sustainability in a constrained funding environment. This phase also included a detailed fiscal review of each proposed budget. Budgets were assessed to ensure that costs were reasonable, necessary, allowable, and aligned with the delivery of direct services. Funding requests were adjusted where expenses fell outside of the scope of what MOVA could reasonably support. For example, some requests for out-of-state training and travel were removed from budgets. Finally, MOVA used a tiered, score-informed funding approach to bring recommendations within the approximately $25 million of funding that was available. Higher scored applications experienced smaller reductions, while lower scoring applications were subject to greater adjustments. After these reductions were applied, each proposal was reviewed holistically to ensure that funding decisions supported the continuation of critical services wherever possible. In some cases, adjustments were made to account for the unique circumstances of smaller, community-based organizations that may have been disproportionately affected by large funding reductions. At the conclusion of Phase 3, MOVA developed 3 separate funding proposals that were presented and approved by the Victim and Witness Assistance Board. The purpose of preparing multiple funding scenarios was to allow MOVA to maximize any additional funding that may become available through ongoing state advocacy efforts. The FY27 Victim and Survivor Services funding and recommendations were presented as 3 separate proposals. Proposal A reflects funding recommendations that is based on currently known and available funding. These are the amounts that were announced on April 16th, 2026. Proposal B reflects the funding recommendations that incorporate the trust line investment at a reduced funding level. Proposal C reflects funding recommendations that incorporate the trust line investment at its full proposed amount of $13.8 million. Together, this strategy provided a framework for allocating any potential available resources while maintaining consistency with the review process and funding priorities previously discussed. This concludes the presentation today. If you have any questions regarding this process, please contact MOVA grants at mass.gov. Thank you for tuning in and for your continued work to support victims and survivors of crime in Massachusetts.